The crown shattered at midnight, not metaphorically, not in some poetic crumbling of influence or slow erosion of power. The ancient Drazhan throne, carved from obsidian quarried in the 11th century, inlaid with silver runes that had kept the vampire courts of Central Europe bound in uneasy allegiance for 800 years, exploded outward in a cascade of black stone and shimmering dust, and the shockwave threw Isadora Nightfall across the throne room floor hard enough to split her lip against the marble. She tasted blood. She got up anyway. "Stay down," someone hissed from the shadows at the edge of the room. One of the Drazhan house guards, she thought, though she could not be certain in the chaos. Bodies moved everywhere, vampire courtiers scrambling for the exits, lesser nobles pressing themselves against the walls. The ancient chandeliers overhead swaying from the force of whatever had detonated the throne. But Isadora Nightfall did not stay down. She stood, pressed her sleeve to her bleeding lip, and looked across the ruined dais where Cassian Drazhan knelt in the wreckage of his inheritance. He was the most dangerous thing she had ever seen. He was also, she had come to understand over the past 6 months, the only person in this world, human or immortal, who had never once has lied to her. His hair was white as bleached bone, falling loose around his shoulders where the silver circlet that marked him as heir had been torn away. His skin was the pale of old ivory, flawless and cold-looking, even when she knew from experience that when he held her hand in moments of rare, unguarded tenderness, he was far warmer than any vampire had the right to be. His eyes were the deep crimson of aged wine, and right now they were burning with something that was not grief and not rage, but some terrible composite of both. The throne of House Drazhan, seat of the oldest vampire court in the Northern Compact, was dust, and the man who had destroyed it, Lord Sulcis, High Chancellor of the Compact, a vampire so old his white hair had gone translucent at the temples, stood at the opposite end of the room with his hands clasped behind his back, watching Cassian kneel in the rubble with an expression of absolute satisfaction. "The blood law is clear," Sulcis said. His voice was the kind of quiet that commanded perfect silence from everyone around it. "Without the throne, there is no seat. Without the seat, there is no heir. House Drazhan falls to receivership under Compact authority."
"Your line ends tonight, Cassian."
Cassian rose from his knees. He did it slowly, deliberately, and every vampire in that room took an involuntary step backward when he straightened to his full height, because even without a crown and without a throne, Cassian Drazhan, in the center of his own house, radiated something ancient and irrefutable, something that had nothing to do with titles and everything to do with blood. "My line," Cassian said in a voice like the low register of a cathedral organ, "has stood for 8 centuries. You destroyed a chair, Varan, not my house. The blood law, I know what the blood law says." Cassian's crimson gaze swept the room, and it landed on Isadora. For just a moment, one fractured. Luminous instant, everything Isadora had spent 6 months trying not to feel for him rose up through her chest like water through cracked stone. Then his expression shuttered, and he looked back at Sulcis. "And I know who wrote it." That was when Isadora understood that this was not simply an act of court politics. This was a trap they had both walked into, and the way out was going to require something none of the ancient Compact blood laws had ever accounted for. It was going to require her. She had not come to the Drazhan court 6 months ago under any illusion that she was welcome. She was Isadora Nightfall, last living heir of the Nightfall Accord, a human treaty house that had served as diplomatic intermediaries between the Northern Compact's vampire courts and the human governments of 3 countries for nearly 200 years. The Nightfall family were not human servants. They were not blood-pledged. They were something rarer and far more precarious, human equals recognized by ancient covenant as holding a seat at the table of immortal politics. Most of the vampire courts resented them for it. Sulcis had been engineering the fall of both House Drazhan and the Nightfall Accord simultaneously for years. Isadora had only realized this 3 weeks ago. Buried in the archive sublevels beneath the Drazhan estate, a converted Habsburg palace outside Vienna, hidden behind modern glass and steel that fooled the human city above it. Reading letters exchanged between Sulcis and 2 other Compact lords that were decades old. Letters planning this exact moment. She had brought those letters to Cassian. She still remembered the way his expression had gone utterly still as he read them. The way he had set the papers on the desk between them, with the careful control of someone who was choosing very deliberately not to put his fist through the nearest wall. He had looked up at her, and there had been something in his eyes that she was not ready to name yet, but that had made her breath catch in a way she also was not ready to examine. "How long have you known?" he had asked. 3 weeks, she said. "I needed to verify all of it before I came to you. I wasn't going to walk in here with a theory." He had studied her for a long moment. "Most humans in your position would have taken that information to the Compact Council and traded it for protection." "I'm not most humans," she said, "and you've been protecting me for 6 months while I learned your archive. I thought that deserved honesty in return." Something shifted in him then, something she could not have named, but that she would spend many nights afterward trying to reconstruct the exact texture of. He had nodded once, slowly. "Thank you," he said. And it sounded like he meant something much larger than the words themselves. That had been 3 weeks ago. Tonight, Sulcis had moved faster than either of them expected. Standing in the wreckage of the throne room now, her lip still bleeding, Isadora pulled herself fully upright and did what she had always done in impossible situations, she thought. The blood law that Sulcis was citing required a physical throne in continuous operation as the vessel of house authority. It was one of the oldest laws in the Compact, so old that most modern vampires considered it ceremonial. But Sulcis, being 8 centuries old himself, knew that it was not ceremonial at all. The obsidian throne was more than furniture. It was a binding object, a focal point for the House Covenant, and its destruction did genuinely threaten the formal standing of House Drazhan under Compact law. But here was what Sulcis had not accounted for. He had not accounted for the Nightfall Accord. Specifically, he had not accounted for what was written in the original Covenant document of the Nightfall Accord. The one Isadora had read so many times in her childhood that she could recite it from memory. A clause, a small one, buried deep in the archaic language of the 15th century, easy to overlook if you did not know what you were looking for. A human treaty house, in recognition of their seat among the courts, held the right of covenant witness, which meant that a Nightfall heir could formally recognize a house compact in the absence of its physical binding object, serving as living covenant until a new one could be established. No one had ever used it. In 200 years of the Nightfall Accord, no house throne had ever been destroyed until tonight. Isadora walked forward through the scattered stone and silver dust, across the ruined dais, and stopped 3 steps below, where Cassian stood in the rubble of his throne. "Lord Sulcis," she said. Her voice was steady. She had practiced steadiness so long that it was almost natural now, though she could feel her heart hammering against her ribs. "I invoke the Accord." Every vampire in the room went very still. Sulcis turned to look at her for the first time since the explosion, and his expression cycled through surprise, calculation and fury in rapid succession before it settled back into control. "You have no standing here, Nightfall girl. Your accord has no Article 9, Clause 4 of the original Nightfall Covenant, ratified in the year 1491 and never revoked." Isadora met his translucent eyes without flinching. "The Nightfall heir serves as living covenant witness for any compact house whose binding object has been destroyed, until such time as a new binding is established. House Drazhan does not fall tonight, Chancellor. I am standing in the place of its throne." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Isadora had ever experienced. Behind her, she heard Cassian exhale. It was a very small sound. It might have been her name. Sulcis moved, fast, the way old vampires moved when they stopped performing human pace. A blur of motion that put him directly in front of her in less than a heartbeat. And Isadora did not flinch because she had learned, in 6 months among vampires, that flinching was the worst thing a human could do. She held his gaze. His eyes were pale silver, old enough that the crimson had faded almost entirely. "You understand what you're invoking?" His voice was soft and very dangerous. "If you stand as living covenant, you are bound to this house until a new throne is constructed. You cannot leave. You cannot renounce. You are property of House Drazhan under blood law." "I am not property," Isadora said. "I am covenant witness. There is a legal distinction, and you know it." "The practical difference," Sulcis said, "is negligible." "The legal difference," she said, "is everything. and you are a man who has just demonstrated that you believe very deeply in the letter of ancient law. She let that sit for a moment. So you will honor this one. His nostrils flared, his expression was pure, distilled hatred, and it was directed entirely at her. Then, very slowly, he took a step back. This is not over, he said to the room at large, and specifically to Cassian, who had come up behind Isadora so silently that she had not heard him approach. No, Cassian agreed, it is not. Sulcis left. His retinue followed. The remaining Drazhan courtiers slowly reformed, and Isadora stood on the dais while the adrenaline that had been carrying her began very quietly to fail, and she became aware that her hands were shaking and her lip hurt considerably more than it had a moment ago. Cassian touched her elbow. Just his fingertips. It was the lightest possible contact, barely there, and it steadied her completely. "Come with me," he said. He led her through the back corridors of the estate, past the grand public rooms and down into the private levels, where the ancient stone foundations of the original Habsburg structure showed through the modern renovation, into a sitting room that she had visited twice before, small, firelit, lined with books in 6 languages, with windows that looked out on the underground garden. He sat her on the settee and disappeared briefly, returning with a small first aid kit that would have looked absurd in any context other than this one. A vampire lord kneeling on the floor in front of a human woman, opening a bandage kit with careful hands. "I can do that," she said. "I know you can." He did it anyway. The cut on her lip was small. He cleaned it with the measured attention of someone accustomed to being responsible for the welfare of others, and she watched him work and tried to remember the last time anyone had taken care of her. It had been a long time. Her father had died when she was 21. Her mother had been gone before that. The Nightfall Accord's responsibility had fallen to her at an age when most young women were finishing university degrees, and she had shouldered it the way she shouldered everything. With both hands and her jaw set. She was 24 now. She watched his white hair fall forward over his face as he bent to examine the cut, and something inside her chest made a sound like a door she had been leaning against for a very long time finally giving way. "You knew about that clause," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, you came prepared for the possibility of tonight. I came prepared for several possibilities." She paused. "I didn't want to tell you about it beforehand. I needed it to be my choice in the moment, not a plan we'd rehearsed." He looked up at her. His crimson eyes were very close. "Why?" he asked. It was a simple question and a very complex one simultaneously, and Isadora took a moment before she answered it. "Because if I had told you," she said quietly, "you would have refused to let me use it." He held her gaze for a long, charged moment. Then he stood and sat on the settee beside her, and he did not move away, and neither did she, and the fire made the room warm and amber-lit. "You're bound to this house now," he said, "until the new throne is built. Do you understand what you've committed yourself to?" Sulcis said it himself. "I can't leave. I can't renounce." She looked at the fire. "I understand, Isadora." The way he said her name was different from how anyone else said it. Lower, more careful, as though he were handling something he did not want to break. "I would not have consented to this, I know. That troubles me less than it should," he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the fire, but his jaw was tight, and there was something working behind his expression. Something that the careful composure of centuries almost, but not entirely, concealed. "Cassian," she said. He looked at her. "I did it because it was the right thing to do," she said, "and because your house deserves to stand, and because Sulcis destroying it would have been a catastrophic injustice to every court in the Compact." She paused. "And because I couldn't watch him take everything from you and do nothing." The silence between them lasted approximately 4 seconds. It felt significantly longer. "I have been alive for 312 years, Cassian said. "In that time I have had advisors, allies, enemies, and occasional lovers. I have never had anyone do what you did tonight for any reason that was not fundamentally transactional." Isadora swallowed. It should have been transactional. I should have leveraged the clause for a better accord position. That would have been the politically intelligent thing to do. "Yes," he said. "It would have. I didn't want to be politically intelligent tonight," she said. "I just wanted to help you." Cassian looked at her for a long time. Then, with the exquisite deliberateness of someone who had decided to stop performing restraint, He reached over and tucked a strand of her dark hair behind her ear. His fingertips were cool and very gentle. "The new throne," he said. "We need to discuss how to build it." And just like that, they were back in practical territory, but the air between them had changed and they both knew it, and neither of them pretended otherwise. Rebuilding a vampire house throne was not like going to a quarry and ordering new stone. The binding law required specific materials, obsidian of the correct geological provenance, silver that had been in continuous use within the house for at least a century, and a covenant inscription performed by someone with formal standing in compact authority. The obsidian from the original throne, now dust, had been quarried in what was currently Slovenia from a deposit that did not exist anymore, which meant they needed to find an alternative. Which meant compact negotiations. Which meant walking directly into the structure that Sulcis controlled. "He'll block every formal channel," Isadora said the following morning. She had not slept, neither had Cassian, though immortals required significantly less sleep than humans, and she suspected he simply had not tried. And they were both in the study with coffee and a map of the compact's political landscape spread across the desk. "He has allies on the material approval board. He'll challenge the provenance of any substitute stone." "Which is why," Cassian said, leaning over the map with hands braced on the desk, "we don't go through the formal channel." Isadora looked up. "You want to bypass the approval board. I want to invoke a precedent older than the approval board's existence." He tapped a location on the map. Eastern Austria, the location of a compact archive that predated the compact itself. There are binding materials in the Veltheim deposit, pre-compact obsidian. The blood law does not require compact approval for materials that existed before the compact's jurisdictions was established. Sulcis knows this too, which is why he hasn't mentioned it. "Because he's hoping we won't think of it," Isadora said. "Or he has something planned at Veltheim." Cassian straightened. "Which means we need to get there before he moves." "We," Isadora said, his eyes met hers. "You are the living covenant of this house. Where the house goes, you go." "I was going to suggest it regardless," she said. "I want to be clear about that." Something very close to a smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. On Cassian Drazhan's face, a near smile was the approximate emotional equivalent of anyone else laughing warmly. She had come to understand this about him over 6 months, and she found she treasured it. They left that night. Cassian, Isadora, and 2 members of the house guard. Mircea, an older vampire whose short white hair was going silver at the edges, and who had served the Drazhan house for over a century, and Petra, who was younger by immortal standards and carried a look of perpetual alertness that Isadora found both reassuring and slightly anxiety-inducing. The drive from Vienna to the Eastern Austrian site took 3 hours. They drove in a black vehicle that managed to look simultaneously modern and somehow feudal, and Isadora sat in the back beside Cassian and watched the Austrian countryside darken around them as they moved away from the city lights. "Tell me something," she said somewhere in the 2nd hour. He looked at her. He had been silent for most of the drive, which was ordinary for him, but it was the comfortable silence of someone thinking, rather than the closed silence of someone shutting her out. "What would you like to know? The throne, the original one." She hesitated. "Were you there when it was made?" "I was 7 years old," he said. "By vampire reckoning, that is. I had been made for 7 years. My grandfather commissioned it. I remember watching the craftsman work the obsidian." He paused. "I remember thinking it looked like frozen night." "That is a very poetic thought for a 7-year-old, Isadora said. "I was a very strange child," he said. And there it was, the near smile again, and this time it lasted long enough that she saw it fully, and it transformed his face in a way that made her feel like she had been handed something very private. "Cassian," she said, and then stopped. "Yes?" She looked at him. His white hair was loose against his dark coat. The darkness outside the window framed him in a way that was almost painfully cinematic, and she was acutely aware that she had been cataloguing his face for 6 months without ever letting herself call it what it was. "Nothing," she said. "We're almost there." He looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. "I know," he said, and she was not entirely sure they were talking about the same thing. The Veltheim deposit was accessible through an old estate that the compact maintained nominally, a converted hunting lodge in the foothills that looked abandoned from the outside, but was watched very carefully from within. They left the vehicle on a forest road and went on foot, Messiah and Petra flanking them with the particular quiet of beings who could move through dark woodland without disturbing a single leaf. Isadora could not move through dark woodland without disturbing leaves. She was human, she had reasonable outdoor skills from a childhood that involved more diplomatic travel than most people's adult lives. But she was not supernaturally silent. When a branch snapped under her boot in the first 5 minutes, she felt Cassian's hand close around her arm, not grabbing, not restraining, just steadying, and he moved her slightly to the left, onto a path she had not seen. Where the ground was softer, he kept his hand there for longer than necessary. She did not mention it. The deposit was in a chamber beneath the lodge, accessible through what appeared to be a wine cellar, but opened into something much older once you knew where to press on the stone. Inside, by the light of what Cassian described simply as house light, a small sphere of luminescence that Messiah produced from a case, the obsidian, was extraordinary. Black and so deeply polished that it reflected everything, veined with natural inclusions of red iron oxide that made it look, in certain lights, like something alive. "This will work," Isadora said, examining it. She had read enough of the binding specifications in the archive to know what was needed. The provenance is pre-compact. The quality is actually superior to the original. Then we take what we need and go. Cassian crouched beside the deposit and ran one pale hand across the surface. For a moment the touch looked almost reverent. My grandfather would have approved. That was when Petra spoke from the entrance of the chamber, very quietly, in a tone Isadora had learned to recognize as the vampire equivalent of alarm. "We have company." 2 things happened simultaneously. Cassian stood, and from the entrance above, the sound of multiple sets of feet on stone. Sulcis had been faster than they anticipated. Not because he was smarter. Isadora did not believe for a moment that he was smarter than Cassian, but because he had more people watching. He had known they would come to Veltheim. He had simply gotten here first and waited. "How many?" Cassian said to Petra, very quiet. 6, maybe 8. Petra's hand was inside her coat. They came from the north side, 8 against 4, 2 of whom were among the strongest Drazhan guards currently living. The odds were not impossible, but they were not good, and Isadora was the only human in the room, which meant that in any physical confrontation she was simultaneously the highest liability and the person prioritize, protecting above all other considerations, which would compromise his effectiveness. She had thought about this contingency. "Give me the house light," she said. Everyone looked at her. "Messiah, give me the sphere." She held out her hand. "I have a better use for it than illuminating the chamber." Messiah looked at Cassian. Cassian looked at Isadora. "What are you planning?" "The Veltheim deposit records," she said. "There's a secondary access point in this chamber. I read about it in the archive. There's a tunnel system that predates the lodge by 3 centuries. It comes out on the east side of the hill, away from wherever Sulcis's people came from." She met Cassian's eyes. "But I need the light to navigate the secondary passage, while you hold them here, long enough for us to carry out what we came for. You'll be alone in the tunnel." "For approximately 10 minutes, she said. "I've mapped it. Petra comes with me to carry the stone. You and Messiah hold the entrance. The secondary passage is too narrow for more than one person at a time, and Sulcis people don't know it's there, or they'd have covered it." He looked at her the way he sometimes looked at her, like he was calculating every possible risk simultaneously, and finding all of them intolerable. And she looked back at him with the expression she had developed specifically to meet that gaze, which was the expression of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and needed him to trust that. 10 minutes, he said. 10 minutes, she confirmed. He cupped her face in both hands. It was sudden and complete, and she had not expected it. And she felt the coolness of his palms and the very deliberate care of the gesture, thumbs barely brushing her cheekbones, and he looked at her with 300 years of contained feeling behind his crimson eyes. "If anything happens to you," he said quietly, "I will dismantle the entire compact." "Nothing will happen to me," she said. "And you'd dismantle the compact for nothing." "Not for nothing," he said. They looked at each other for one more second. Then he released her, and she and Petra went for the secondary passage with the house light and the tools they needed for the obsidian. and Cassian and Mercia moved toward the entrance to meet whoever was coming down. The secondary tunnel was exactly as Isadora had read it, narrow, low-ceilinged, carved by hand several centuries ago, smelling of old mineral earth and damp stone. She navigated it by memory and the soft sphere of light, moving as quickly as the ceiling height allowed, with Petra behind her carrying the carefully wrapped sections of obsidian they had extracted in the 3 minutes before the intrusion. She heard, distantly, the sounds of confrontation from the chamber behind them. Cassia's voice, controlled and authoritative. Another voice, not Sulcis, one of his people, trying to answer with similar authority and failing to achieve it. She did not look back. She counted her steps and kept moving. The tunnel came out as the archive had promised, through a hatch in the hillside concealed beneath an overgrown section of hedgerow. Petra went through first, checked the perimeter in the specific economical way that house guards cleared spaces, and then helped Isadora up and out into the cold Austrian night air. They were on the east side. The vehicles were to the west. They needed to circle around without encountering Sulcis's people, which meant going through the tree line, which meant the dark forest that she had already established she was not supernaturally quiet in. "I'll carry you," Petra said. Isadora opened her mouth to say she was fine. Then she calculated the noise she would make against the time available and said, "All right." Being carried at vampire speed through a dark forest while clinging to a house guard who was, simultaneously carrying, a wrapped section of pre-compact obsidian, was not an experience she had anticipated having. It was over in slightly under 2 minutes, and they emerged at the vehicles. At the same time, Cassian and Mercia came from the west, moving fast but unhurried in the way that meant the situation was resolved rather than still active. Cassian reached her in 4 steps and stood very close, examining her face, his hands briefly at her shoulders. "I told you," she said. "You did," he said. He exhaled slowly. It sounded like relief stripped of its performance. "We need to go." "Sulcis's people?" "Will not be a problem tonight." His jaw was set. "We need to go now." They drove back to Vienna faster than they had come, and somewhere in the first hour, Isadora fell asleep in the back seat against Cassian's shoulder because she had been awake for nearly 40 hours and her body made the decision without consulting her. She did not know she had done it until she woke, briefly, and found that his arm had moved to accommodate her and that he was very carefully not moving. She closed her eyes again. When she woke properly, they were back in Vienna, and it was nearly dawn, and Cassian was watching her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Open in a way he was not usually open, unguarded in a way that 3 centuries had trained out of him. He shuttered it immediately when he saw her eyes open, but not quite fast enough. "We're back," he said. "I noticed," she said and sat up. Her hair was a disaster and her neck ached, and she did not care about either of these things because of the expression she had almost caught on his face. "How long was I asleep?" 2 hours. You should have woken me." "You needed the sleep," he said simply. "I did not." She looked at him. The pre-dawn light through the vehicle's tinted windows made everything grey and quiet. She was very tired, and perhaps that was why she said what she said next. Or perhaps it was simply that she had been not saying it for 6 months, and the previous night had taken the last of her capacity for restraint. "Cassian," she said, "I need to tell you something." He waited. "When I invoked the Accord last night," she said, "I told myself it was because it was right, and it was right. I believe that completely." She paused. "But that wasn't the whole reason." "I know," he said. She blinked. "You know, I have known for some time," he said, with the very particular precision of someone choosing every word carefully. "I chose not to address it because I was not certain what the honorable response was. Given the imbalance of our situation, you are bound to this house by your own invocation. Anything I said if you were free again would be complicated by that constraint." Isadora stared at him. "You were protecting me from pressure," she said slowly. "From feeling like you'd said something because I was obligated to be here." "Yes, that is," she said, "the most thoughtful and the most infuriating thing I have ever heard." "Yes," he said again. She took a breath. "Then I'll wait," she said, "until the throne is built and I'm released from the covenant, and then I will say what I want to say. And you will respond however you respond. But I want you to know that my answer will not change based on whether I'm bound here or not." He looked at her for a long, still moment. I know that too, he said quietly. The work of building the new throne took 3 weeks. It was not simply construction. The obsidian had to be shaped by a craftsman with compact standing, a concession to the blood law that could not be circumvented, and finding one who was not aligned with Sulcis required careful negotiation. Cassian reached across old alliances and older friendships, and eventually a craftsman came from the Prague court, an ancient vampire named Orlov, whose white hair was braided with copper wire in the old Eastern tradition, and who looked at the Velthium obsidian with something approaching reverence. Better than what you had, Orlov confirmed, in the workshop level of the estate where he had set up his tools. The iron inclusions will make the binding stronger. He looked up at Cassian. Your grandfather chose the original stone because it was available. You have chosen better. The Nightfall heir chose it, Cassian said. Orlov looked at Isadora with frank assessment. You know the binding specifications. I read them in the archive, she said, several times. Can you quote the secondary clause of the inscription requirement? She did, word for word in the original 15th century Latin. Orlov looked faintly startled, then pleased. Good, he said. You will supervise the inscription. I need someone with Accord standing present for the covenant texts, and your Latin is better than anyone in this house. It is not, Cassian said mildly. It is better than mine, Isadora said, and that is almost certainly what Orlov means. Cassian gave her the near smile. The 3 weeks were not peaceful. Sulcis moved through official channels, challenges to the Velthium provenance, formal complaints about the craftsman's standing, procedural objections filed with the compact council that arrived one after another, like waves designed to exhaust rather than to succeed individually. Cassian answered each one with methodical, devastating precision, and Isadora worked beside him in the study most evenings, drafting responses, cross-referencing blood law clauses, building the legal architecture of their defense. She had not anticipated how much she would enjoy working beside him. He was rigorous in a way that satisfied something deep in her own intellectual character. He read everything before he responded to it. He asked her opinion on things and listened when she answered and pushed back when he disagreed and was willing to be wrong. He made coffee in the evenings, proper coffee, strong and bitter, though he could not drink it himself, because he had learned early on that she needed it after the 6th hour of document review. She had mentioned it once. He had never forgotten. These were the things she catalogued about him in those 3 weeks, the quiet acts of attention that accumulated into something she no longer had any intention of pretending was not what it was. One evening, late, when the fire had burned low and the legal documents were stacked in neat order and the night outside was very still, she looked up from the letter she was drafting and found him watching her. What? She said. I was thinking, he said, that you are the most remarkable person I have met in 312 years. She set down her pen. You've met a lot of people in 312 years. Yes, he said. That is why the statement is significant. She looked at him. The firelight made him look different from the cold grandeur of the court, less like a sovereign and more like a person, which was perhaps the most dangerous version of him. Cassian, she said. The throne will be complete in 4 days, he said. I am aware of the conversation we have agreed to defer. I am informing you that I am aware of it. I am aware that you are aware, she said. Good, he said. I wanted to be certain. They both looked back at their work. But she was smiling at the document, and she was relatively sure that if she looked up, she would catch him doing the same thing. Sulcis made one final move on the night before the throne was due to be installed. He himself this time, which was either bold or desperate or both. He arrived at the estate's formal entrance with a delegation of 5 compact council members, a quorum, technically sufficient to convene an emergency session of compact authority, and a document claiming that the Nightfall Accord's covenant witness clause had never been formally ratified by the compact council and was therefore not valid blood law. It was a fabrication. Isadora knew it was a fabrication because she had the original ratification document in a temperature-controlled case in the archive sublevel, a copy of which she had taken the precaution of digitizing and transmitting to 6 different secure locations the week after she had invoked the clause, specifically because she anticipated exactly this kind of challenge. She stood in the estate's grand entry hall, facing Sulcis and his council members across the inlaid stone floor, while Cassian stood slightly behind and to her left. Not because she needed protection, but because he was making a deliberate point about whose ground this was and who was standing on it. "The ratification document," she said, "is in our archive. You are welcome to examine it. However, I have taken the additional precaution of transmitting certified digital copies to the Accord's human legal partners, to the Independent Compact Archive in Prague. Hello. Orlov, and to 2 newspaper editors who have standing agreements with the Nightfall Accord regarding the disclosure of supernatural political interference with human treaty rights." Orlov, who had apparently been alerted and had come up from the workshop level, gave a small nod from the back of the room. The newspaper editors were not a bluff. They were a measure she genuinely hoped not to use, because bringing human media attention to the compact would be complicated for everyone. But she had established the relationship 2 weeks ago, precisely because it was the kind of deterrent that worked regardless of whether you were human or immortal. Sulcis looked at the council members. The council members looked at each other. "You've been planning this since the night of the throne's destruction," Sulcis said. "I've been planning for it since I arrived at this estate 6 months ago," Isadora said. "The night of the throne's destruction simply determined which plan I used." Sulcis's pale silver eyes moved to Cassian. "You're going to let a human girl fight your battles for you?" "She is not fighting my battles," Cassian said, and his voice was quiet and absolute in the way that made the air in a room change quality. "She is fighting her own. This is her house covenant to protect, as much as it is mine. I would suggest you consider carefully what it means that a Nightfall heir has chosen to defend House Drazhan with this degree of commitment, and what the other treaty houses will think when they learn of it." That was a point Sulcis had clearly not fully calculated. The Nightfall Accord had standing relationships with 11 other human treaty houses across Europe. If word reached them that the Nightfall heir had formally backed House Drazhan against compact aggression, which it would, because Isadora had also sent very careful letters to 9 of the 11 houses over the past 3 weeks, the political landscape shifted considerably. It was not that the treaty houses had power over the compact in any direct military sense, but they had something nearly as valuable: legitimate standing in the human institutions that the vampire courts had to operate around. Banking relationships, property law, government recognition. The infrastructure of modern life that immortal courts could not simply ignore. The compact needed the treaty houses far more than it liked to admit. "This will be reviewed," Sulcis said. "Please do review it," Isadora said. "I recommend beginning with Article 9 and reading slowly." He left. It was not, she suspected, the last they would see him. But it was the last they would see of him in this particular battle, and that was enough for now. The night after Sulcis departed, Cassian found her in the underground garden. It was her favorite part of the estate, a vast atrium below the building's main level, temperature-controlled and lit by specialized lamps that simulated sunlight on a cycle, allowing genuine plantings of roses and wisteria and things that needed light to grow. Isadora did not know who had designed it or when, but she found it startling and lovely. She was sitting on a stone bench among the roses when Cassian came through the garden door, and she looked up and saw immediately that he was in one of his rarer moods. Not distant, not formal, but simply present in a way he sometimes was when he allowed himself to be. He sat beside her on the bench. "The craftsmen finish the installation tomorrow morning," he said. "By midday, the new throne will be in place, and the covenant texts will be read, and the house binding will be restored." He paused. "Your role as covenant witness will be formally complete." "I know," she said. "I have been waiting," he said, "to have a conversation with you about something. I said I would wait until you were free of the covenant obligation. As of tomorrow midday, you will be." I said my answer wouldn't change, she said. "I know." He turned to look at her, fully, in the way he sometimes did when he had decided to stop being careful. "I want to say something to you first, before you say anything. I want to tell you what this has been from my side." She was very still. "I am 312 years old," he said. "I have learned to be careful with what I allow myself to feel, because the duration of my existence means that loss is not abstract to me. Everyone I have cared for who was human has died. My mother was human. She died when I was 70 years old, young by our measure, and it was the most formative pain of my existence. I chose after that to keep a certain distance from human connection. Not from humans themselves. I have never been indifferent to humans, but from the kind of caring that becomes weight-bearing. Isadora listened. She did not move. When you came here 6 months ago, he continued, I expected someone with your family's reputation, intelligent, composed, politically capable. I expected to respect you professionally. I did not expect. He paused, and for the first time she saw something that might have been difficulty in finding words, which was remarkable on a face that was usually so perfectly articulate. I did not expect that you would be you. Who did you expect me to be? She asked softly. Not someone who falls asleep in my archive and argues with my house staff about the correct interpretation of 15th century Latin and brings me evidence of a conspiracy at potential personal risk to herself, because she thought I deserved to know. He looked at her steadily. Not someone who stands up in front of 800 years of compact authority and invokes a clause she has memorized from a document her family signed before she was born, and doesn't flinch. I flinched a little, she said. On the inside. I know, he said. That makes it better, not worse. She looked at him. The garden was very quiet around them, the roses dark-colored in the simulated night cycle, the air warm and scented. Cassian, she said, I came here as a diplomat. I plan to do my job carefully, maintain the Accord's interests, and leave with everything professionally intact. Yes, he said. That plan failed approximately 2 months in, she said. I know when it failed, he said. It was the evening you argued with me about the blood law amendment of 1542 for 2 hours, and then told me I was right, but explained why that was worse, not better. I remember it precisely. She laughed. She could not help it. A real laugh surprised out of her. That was the evening for you? When were you aware of the problem? He asked. She thought about it. When you made coffee, she said. The second time. I had not mentioned it a second time. You just noticed and made it. She shook her head. It was such a small thing. Small things accumulate, he said. They do, she agreed. He was looking at her with that open expression again, the one he could not quite maintain his composure through, and she thought about what he had said about loss, about his mother, about the choice he had made to hold back from the kind of caring that becomes weight-bearing. She thought about what it meant that he was here, saying these things, with his guard down and his century-trained composure set deliberately aside. She understood what it cost him. She thought it might be the most significant gift she had ever been given. I'm human, she said. You know that. I know you know what that means in terms of... I know what it means, he said. I have thought about little else for the past 4 months. I am not asking you for a certainty about the future. I am asking you to let me be honest with you about what you are to me, and to let that be something we navigate together rather than something I protect you from by saying nothing. She looked at him. And what am I to you? He reached out and took her hand, not briefly, not incidentally, held it, both of his hands around hers, which were smaller and warmer than his. He looked at their joined hands for a moment. The most important person in my world, he said. Which is a thing I did not expect to be able to say again and mean it without fear. You have made me less afraid of meaning it. Isadora felt the door inside her chest, the one that had given way the night he took care of her cut lip, swing open the rest of the way. Something on the other side of it was enormous and warm and terrifying, and also, she found, exactly right. Cassian, she said, I love you. I think I have for approximately 4 months, and I have been extremely careful about not saying it, and I am done being careful about that particular thing. He exhaled. It was the same sound he had made the night she invoked the Accord. Not quite her name, not quite a word. Something more foundational than either. He brought her hand up and pressed it to his face, her palm against his cheek, his eyes closing briefly, and she felt how deliberate it was, how much he was choosing to let her see. I love you, he said, in ways I did not think I would permit myself to do again, and with considerably more certainty than anything else I have felt in 300 years. She leaned forward and kissed him, because she had been thinking about it for 4 months, and the time for thinking was over. It was the kind of kiss that was also a conversation, slow and sure, and absolutely without reservation, and when they separated they were both somewhat less composed than they had been. which Isadora considered an excellent outcome. He pressed his forehead to hers. "The covenant ends tomorrow," he said. "Yes," she said. "I want to make you a different offer after that." She pulled back enough to look at him. What kind of offer? Not a blood law. His eyes were very warm despite being the color of dark wine. A personal one. "I want to ask you to stay." He paused. "Not as covenant witness, not as a diplomatic representative of the Nightfall Accord. As the person I would like to build a life with in whatever form that life takes, for as long as you want it." She was quiet for a moment. Not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted to give the moment the full weight it deserved. "There's the question of the accord," she said. "I have responsibilities." "I know," he said. "I am not asking you to abandon them. I have a great deal of space." He gestured, vaguely, at the enormous estate around them. "And the Drazhan house needs a new formal relationship with the Nightfall Accord, given what you've just done for us. There are entirely legitimate institutional reasons to build that partnership in a way that has you here more than you are away." "You've been thinking about the logistics," she said. "I have been thinking about the logistics for 3 months," he said. "I am a very forward-planning person." She laughed again. There it was, him drawing her laughter out, which he had done from the beginning, whether he intended to or not. "Yes," she said. "I want to stay." The installation of the new throne happened the following morning as Orlov had promised, with the precision and ceremony that the blood law required. The obsidian from Veltheim was magnificent, larger and more deeply polished than what had been there before, the iron inclusions catching the light in patterns that shifted as you moved around it, so that the throne seemed to breathe. The inscription was done in proper form, with Isadora speaking the Covenant Latin alongside Orlov and 2 of Cassian's senior house staff, the words moving through the stone room with a resonance she felt in her chest. When the final phrase was spoken and the binding settled, she felt it, physically, like a wave of warm pressure through the air. Orlov nodded once, satisfied, and said, "It holds, the house is restored." The formal words of the Covenant Witness release followed. Cassian read them himself, standing on the dais beside the new throne, and when he spoke the final sentence that released her from the obligation, he looked at her the entire time, and she held his gaze and understood that the releasing and the beginning were happening simultaneously. 3 days later, Isadora sent a formal communication to the Compact Council, co-signed by Cassian, announcing the completion of the new throne, the legal validation of all materials and procedures, and the formal renewal of the Nightfall Accord's relationship with House Drazhan under expanded terms. It was phrased as a diplomatic document. It functionally meant that any future move against House Drazhan would be understood as a move against the Accord and all its treaty house relationships. The response from the Compact Council arrived within 24 hours. It was a formal acknowledgement, no challenge. No counterfiling. Sulcis did not respond at all. He would not disappear. Isadora was not naive enough to think that one political defeat would end his ambitions. But he had overreached significantly, and the Compact Council had seen him overreach, and the balance of power had shifted in ways he would need years to recover from. She brought the Council's response to Cassian in the study. He read it. He set it down on the desk. And then he looked at her across the desk with the expression that she was now intimately familiar with, the open one, the real one, the one that was just for her. "It's done," she said. "The immediate threat is resolved," he said. "Sulcis remains." "He does," she agreed. "We'll deal with him as he moves. We'll see him coming next time." She leaned on the desk. "We're better prepared than he knows." "We," Cassian said. "We," she confirmed. He came around the desk. He stood in front of her and tilted her chin up slightly and kissed her with the slow certainty of someone who knew exactly what he had and intended to take excellent care of it. She kissed him back with equal deliberateness. The months that followed were, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. The Drazhan estate, which had been a place of formal and somewhat isolated purpose during Isadora's first 6 months there, became something different. Partly because the immediate crisis had passed, partly because Isadora had begun quietly reorganizing several things: the archive cataloging system, which had been idiosyncratic to the point of maddening, the diplomatic correspondence protocols, which had not been updated since the 1970s, The relationship with 3 allied houses that had gone dormant for lack of maintenance. She approached all of it with the same methodical intelligence she had brought to the Sulcis crisis, and Cassian watched her do it with the expression he reserved for things he admired deeply. "You are rebuilding the whole structure," he said one evening, as she explained a proposed revision to the Allied House communication protocols. "The throne was the most visible piece," she said, "but a lot of other things needed attention too, I thought. While I'm here and I have access." She paused. "Unless you'd prefer I would prefer," he said, "that you never stop." He looked at her seriously. "You are extraordinary at this, Isadora. The kind of mind that sees systems and knows how to improve them. My grandfather would have..." He stopped. "What?" "He would have loved you," he said. "He valued intelligence and courage above almost everything. He would have said you were exactly the kind of person this house needed." She was quiet for a moment. "That means a great deal to me," she said honestly. "Good," he said. "It was meant to." The question of her mortality, or rather, the disparity of their mortal natures, came up directly one evening in late autumn. They had been together as a declared couple for several months by then, and the question had been present in the air between them since the garden conversation, and Isadora had been thinking about it without yet raising it because she did not want to raise it prematurely. But there was a way it could be addressed. She knew the vampire law on it. She had read it in the archive. She had been considering it carefully from every angle for weeks. "The vampire binding," she said. They were in the sitting room with the underground garden view, the firelight making everything amber, a position that had become something of a home base for their most important conversations. He looked up from the letter he was reading. "I know it exists," she said. "I know it's not the same as the human fictional concept. I know it's a blood covenant that extends the life of a human bound to a vampire house, and that it was used historically in cases of legitimate partnership. I know there are conditions and permanence and significant implications. I have read the specifications." She met his eyes. "I want to discuss it." He set down the letter. "You've been thinking about this," he said. "I have been thinking about this for 3 months," she said. "I wanted to be certain before I raised it." "And are you certain?" "I am not asking you to decide tonight," she said. "I am asking you to have the conversation. Because I don't want to be in this, for as long as we are in this, with the knowledge that I am aging in a different way than you are, and neither of us is willing to discuss it." He looked at her for a long moment. There was nothing guarded about his expression. "The binding is permanent," he said. "It does not turn you. It extends your natural lifespan significantly, several centuries in the documented cases. It aligns your life covenant with the house covenant. It cannot be reversed." "I know," she said. "You would need to want it entirely for yourself," he said. "Not for me, not as a gift to me, not as a sacrifice. For your own reasons." "My reasons are my own," she said. "They are considerable, and they are not primarily about you, though they include you. They are about the Accord, about wanting the time to do the work properly, about..." She stopped, "about not wanting to leave." Cassian was quiet for a moment. "The binding requires consent from both parties," he said. "It requires witnesses. It requires a covenant reading by a recognized vampire authority." He paused. "I would want Orlov to perform it if we did it. He is trustworthy and he has the standing." "I was going to suggest Orlov," she said. "I know," he said. "I know you were." He came across the room and sat beside her and took her hands in both of his, the way he did. "Isadora, I want this. I want you here for as long as you will be here. I want all of it. I want to watch you rebuild every system in this house, and argue about 15th century Latin, and drink coffee at midnight, and make this place into whatever it becomes with both of us in it." She felt the thing inside her chest do something complicated and luminous. "Then we discuss it properly," she said. "We take the time to make sure I understand every implication. We consult the archive. We bring in Orlov for a preliminary conversation." She squeezed his hands. "And then, when we've done it right, we do it." "Yes," he said, "all of that. Exactly that." "Good," she said. He pulled her close, and she rested against his shoulder, and the fire burned low, and the underground garden was quiet through the window. "Isadora," he said quietly after a while. Thank you," he said. "Not only for the throne, for all of it. For being the kind of person who comes in here and refuses to be anything other than exactly herself, and who somehow makes all of this." He paused, searching. Larger, more worth the living of it. She looked up at him. "You're going to make me emotional," she said. "I know," he said. "I have no objection to that." She kissed him. He held her like someone who had made peace with the word permanent and found it, after 300 years, to be something other than frightening. The winter came, and the estate breathed with the particular warmth of a place that had been reorganized around people who cared about it. Mercia and Petra had settled into a new rhythm, less the formal guardedness of a court on alert, and more the easy vigilance of people protecting something they believed in. New alliances were being built carefully. The allied houses that Isadora had re-established contact with began corresponding regularly, and she handled the bulk of the diplomatic work with a fluency that made Cassian's senior staff, who had been skeptical of a human accord representative having this much access and influence, begin to simply accept her as part of the fabric of the house. Orlov came back in December for the preliminary conversations about the binding. He sat with both of them for 4 hours and walked through every specification and implication and condition, and he watched Isadora as she asked her questions, precise, informed, thorough. And afterward he told Cassian privately that he had not seen a human approach this decision with such clarity in his entire professional life. Cassian relayed this to Isadora, who said she was extremely glad her clarity was appreciated, and then went back to the archive. He stood in the doorway watching her read for a moment before she looked up and caught him. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I was simply looking." She gave him a look that communicated considerable fond exasperation. He returned it with the near smile. She went back to her reading. He went to make coffee. These were the small things that accumulated. The binding ceremony happened in late January, on a night when the Vienna streets above were quiet with new snow. Orlov performed it in the covenant chamber of the estate, with Mercia and Petra as witnesses and the new obsidian throne visible through the chamber's open door. Present solid, standing as a reminder of what had been rebuilt. The covenant texts were read in the old language, and Isadora spoke her consent in the same language with the same ease she had brought to the throne inscription. And when Orlov completed the final phrase and the binding settled between them, Isadora felt it. Not like the throne's resonance, which had been a wave of pressure, but like something clicking into place. Like the last lock in a door she had been standing outside of for a long time. She looked at Cassian. He was looking at her with everything in his face that he had spent 300 years learning to conceal, and he was not concealing any of it. "Well," she said softly. "Well," he agreed. Later, when Orlov had gone, and Mercia and Petra had diplomatically disappeared, and it was just the two of them in the small sitting room, with the fire and the underground garden view, Cassian poured 2 glasses of wine. One for her. One that he held primarily as a gesture, and they sat together in the way they had come to sit, close and at ease, with a particular quality of quiet that belongs only to people who have fought for something together and won. "The compact will take note of the binding," she said. "They will," he agreed. "It will be understood as a formal statement." "Good," she said. "I want it understood as a formal statement." "The Nightfall heir formally bound to the Drazhan heir," he said. "There will be political commentary." "There has been political commentary about this house for 8 centuries, she said. "I am not concerned." He smiled. Not the near smile, the real one, the whole thing, which she had seen perhaps a dozen times, and which was the most transformative thing she had ever witnessed on a face that was already extraordinary. "No," he said. "You never are." She raised her glass. "To the throne." He raised his. "To the throne. To the house," she said. "To the house. To whatever we make of the next several centuries," she said. He looked at her with the full warmth of 300 years, finding something it had not expected to find, and intending to hold it carefully for a very long time. "To that," he said. "Above all else." They drank. The fire burned. The new throne stood in the next room, solid and permanent, as the Veltheim mountains that had given it its stone. The snow fell above them on the city streets, and below it all, in the warm amber-lit rooms of House Drazhan, everything was rebuilt. And Isadora Nightfall, diplomat, accord heir, living covenant, and the most important person in Cassian Drazhan's ancient and particular world, leaned her head on his shoulder and felt, with absolute certainty, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. not because she had been trapped here by blood law or obligation, or any force other than her own clear-eyed choice, but because she had looked at an ancient house crumbling and a man kneeling in its ruins with something irreplaceable slipping from his hands. And she had made a decision. She had rebuilt it. And in doing so, without fully intending to, she had also rebuilt something in herself. The certainty that the world had weight and meaning, and that she was capable of shaping both. That love was not a distraction from purpose, but its fullest possible expression. That the most powerful thing she had ever done was not quoting the right clause at the right moment, but walking across a ruined dais toward a man who had never expected anyone to come. He reached over and tucked a strand of her dark hair back from her face. It was the same gesture as the very first time, and it meant all the same things and several more. Outside, Vienna was quiet under its blanket of January snow. Inside, House Drazhan was warm and whole and standing, and the heir and his heiress remained exactly where they had chosen to be, in the amber light of their own particular peace, while the long centuries stretched out ahead of them like an open road.